I'm fine, thank you, Harris. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, it's been a bit of a mental morning, but yeah.
We got there in the end.
Eventually. So just to kind of start this off, I'd like to, if you just explain who you are and what essentially you do.
Right, okay. My name is Simon Snowden. I'm an academic based at the University of Liverpool, and I predominantly teach undergraduate students in a business school, and I'm a director of study for one of the biggest programs in the university, BA Business Management.
Great. So what this came from as well is like I went to your PhD thesis. So what can you just kind of give a brief overview of what that was and what kind of inspired you to do that?
The thesis is an examination of placement student experience. Okay, so many students these days, especially on business courses, like to do what we describe as an industrial placement. So they do a 4-year degree rather than 3, and they'll do their first 2 years at university, and then they'll go out into industry for a year. And then after that year, they come back to the university to complete their degree. Okay, and I've worked quite closely with placement students for nearly a decade now. I was the person who basically got the placement degree in Liverpool off the ground. So I was Director of Education for quite a few years. I'm sorry, not Director of Education. I'll say that again.
That's what you got out, isn't it?
I was Director of Placements for quite a few years. So I kind of forged the structure for it. I supported the students from it and kind of built it from 4 in the initial year when we did it, 4 students on placement, through to around about 120 by the time we left, and we're doing, I think it's about 170 this last year out on placement as part of their degree. So being involved in what those students were going through opened my eyes to many kinds of issues. One was the fact that they were none too pleased when they found out that they had to do academic work whilst they were on placement. So they're doing essentially a full-time job and having to do a module, what is essentially a module whilst they're out there with assessment.
I can imagine that, especially with my work at the minute, and I've got to learn exams and do everything with it, and you think, I just got away from this.
Yeah.
And then they've got to come back.
So they're doing all that, and so they've got that kind of pull on them in terms of the time of the work they're doing. Now, I wouldn't say the work we give them is too onerous. There's a way of approaching it. But also, it was noticing this tension between theory and practice, and how essentially they very quickly kind of drop the stuff they're learning and kind of treat everything in an ad hoc kind of way. And it was these two kind of tensions that really struck me. And I was very interested in how do we, one, do something in terms of the academic element that is actually of use to them. So rather than thinking, oh, it's an onerous task, we've got to get this done, just try and get it out of the way, it's some kind of hurdle, it's actually helping them get a grasp with what is going on while they're on placement and helping them in doing their placement. And 2, trying to understand why people just drop theory at the drop of a hat. You know, why is there such a negative kind of attitudes towards theoretical ideas? And it's, it's not just necessarily placement students. I think this can be in the wider business as well. And
I think you get that a lot
research.
Because you hear it so frequently, is that you go away to do uni and then you kind of learn how to do things afterwards. People don't take a lot of theoretical things and try to apply it. Even you can ask lots of people, probably graduates as well, that they probably don't think about how to do it, and maybe it's a way of kind of changing how you think. But that's kind of aspect of theoretical versus practical, well, transition it is something I really do want to highlight. So what was the kind of way that you kind of approached this then? Because from someone who's originally read your paper, there was 2 distinct features that you used to kind of do this study. So it was the chat, which is the cultural Historical activity theory. And then there's the aspect of the change laboratory, which was what you used with the logs, the online learning logs. Could you just give me a brief introduction for people who are listening of what they are and how you use them?
But chat, we'll just call it activity theory.
Yeah.
I think it's easier. Activity theory is what we describe as a theoretical lens. Okay, so a lens is something that helps bring things into focus, helps you see better. Yeah. So activity theory was the lens through which I begin to understand the experience of students on placement, and I chose it for a couple of reasons. Okay, there's a number of features in activity theory that I think lent themselves I'm an academic, for God's sake, lent themselves to the kind of study I was doing. So activity theory is based upon the idea that the activities we do are the most basic unit of analysis we can do. It's the only way of really understanding human behaviour. Okay, so social activity or societal activity. They make a real distinction between us being a social animal and a societal animal. Social animals, dogs, bees, all the rest of it, all that means is hierarchies in some ways. Societal is trying to make a distinction where actually there's something a bit more. And what it really means is culture.
Yeah,
so therefore, cultural historical activity theory. So activity theory is all based around this notion of we're involved in activities, social activities, and we get a lot of meaning from those social activities, and the way we do the activities are driven by the meaning we derive. Let's go back to some of the basic elements. So activity theory basically says humans do not respond directly to a stimulus. Okay?
Right.
We respond through something called a mediator. So there are other things in our consciousness that affect the way in which we see a response and how we act. Okay? So, for example, if we think about a problem in business, somebody who is in the operations side of a business will see the problem differently to the accountant in the business. Will see it differently to the marketeer in a business, because those different kind of disciplines in a business, those different functions in a business, have a whole set of different mediations, a different way of viewing the world, okay? And therefore it shapes the way they respond to a particular problem. An example I often use to really get the idea around this is mediation is a mixture of cognitive and physical tools, okay? It's artifacts. So a cognitive tool is theory of some variety, a physical tool, well, a hammer. There's the old saying, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem you've got is a nail.
Right.
And treat everything as a nail. And it kind of captures a bit of it. But a really good example is the clock face. Okay,
Right.
Time. Is time real or is it something constructed? Well, time is real in one sense. I'm not going to get into an argument with any physicists.
That could be a whole new other podcast.
We will avoid that. But the clock face is a human construct. Okay, but where does it come from? Why is it 12 hours on the clock face? Why is it 24 hours in a day? Why 60 seconds in a minute? And 60 minutes in an hour? Where does all that come from? Well, some of the speculation around all this dates from sort of really ancient societies, okay, in the Middle East. And it's about counting mechanisms. So our counting is base 10 in the West. And because it seems to have always been that, it seems the most natural way of counting. Where does base 10 come from, Harris?
Yeah, who knows?
With our fingers.
Oh,
because we've got 10 digits. It's that kind of thing. Well, it looks as though in a number of ancient societies, the counting base was 12.
Right.
So where does that come from?
They have an extra finger in each hand.
Well, what it is still to do with the hand.
Right.
Okay? And it's to do with our four fingers. So if you pull up your right hand and you've got four fingers, what have you also got on each finger? You've got three different positions. So the tip, the middle between the two knuckles, and then the bottom. And then if you count those off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Right.
So there's that speculation that people were counting using their thumb on those 3 segments in the finger, 4 fingers, 3 segments, there's your 12.
The thumb was an actual tool instead of an object.
But the whole hand's the tool for counting.
Yeah.
So the hand creates, the physical tool creates a cognitive tool, a counting system. Now what's the other hand doing while this is counting off 12s? Well, it's counting off the number of 12s.
Right.
And what's 5 12s?
60.
60.
Yeah.
And we start to get the notion of 60 minutes, 60 seconds. Yeah?
Right.
And the 12. But why is it 24 hours?
12 times by 2 is 24.
But where does the 2 come from? Well, it tends to be
day and night.
Pardon?
With the aspect of day and night, then.
Yeah, bang, Harris.
There we are.
I knew you deserved that degree you got.
So I didn't get a 2-1 for nothing.
So, in a lot of ancient societies, day and night are seen as 2 different realms. So 12 hours in each. Okay? Now, we're used to an hour being of a specified length. Yeah? They're all the same length. Every hour is the same length. But in these ancient societies, it wasn't. Because 12 was simply divided between the hours of daylight and the hours of nighttime. And as we know, as the Earth revolves around the sun, those lengths of day and night change, so the lengths of hours would change over the course of a year, depending between night and day. Okay, so there is an example of mediation. The physical tool that is the hand and how we use it to count. The physical tool that is the hand mediates how we develop a counting system. Okay.
Right.
And that counting system then in turn mediates another cognitive tool to understand time, along with a view of the world that is night and day are 2 separate realms. So that's mediation. It's a really good example of mediation and how humans use both cognitive and physical tools to try and understand the world in which they're in and to develop behaviours, to develop the ability to intervene in the world. Okay? So that mediation is really kind of critical in there. Okay? But obviously, you're not mediated by one thing. You're mediated by lots of different things.
The whole nurture element is that the way you get brought up, and there's so many different influences, and that's essentially such a big influence on how you become as a mediator.
Exactly. So all of our responses are a mixture of all those mediations. Now, all those mediations coming together, all those different ideas, influences, thoughts, and all that lot, they create conflicts. Okay? They create what activity call contradictions, okay, structural tensions, if you like. Now, the argument is that we live permanently in this state of structural tension, in a chronic state of structural tension. You'll know it yourself from the workplace. You're asked to do one thing by one boss, but your customer wants to do something else, and the higher boss wants to do something else yet again. And it's like, well, how do I balance this out? And on the whole, we find ways of balancing them. But on some occasions, those contradictions move from a state of being chronic to an acute state. In other words, they have to be resolved in some way. You can't continue the way they are, and you have to find a resolution. Okay? And in activity theory, they talk about having critical encounters. These critical encounters are situations that generate this acute status for contradictions. And then having to reconceptualize what you're doing, think about it in different ways, and take what they call volitional actions, your own agency, if you like, to be able to resolve that. And this is quite important because of what I said before with the students, that one, they had a structural tension in terms of they had a job to do and they had academic work to do. These two things, these were fighting over their time. And also, this contradiction between theory and practice. They'd be learning all this stuff in class, but it didn't seem appropriate or applicable in the workplace. And so they were kind of dropping it. So both of these things seem to echo my experiences, and activity theory seemed to provide a way of beginning to understand it. And furthermore, the Change Lab is a particular tool used in activity theory. So it provided me with a method to begin to explore, one, what was causing a lot of these problems, and two, how we can begin to resolve them and help students resolve them. So the Change Lab is a technique for managing change in organisations. and it comes out of a guy called Engström and a university in Finland. And essentially what it is having a number of interventions. So it's an interventionist approach. The researcher facilitator is a little bit like an agitator, trying to stir things up a bit. And they have a set of what they call expansive learning actions or phases: questioning, analysing, modelling, consolidating, implementation. So different phases you move through, different process of moving through these phases, if you like. But also something called the double stimulation.
Right.
Okay? And the double stimulation is really important. So the double stimulation is about a primary stimulation and a secondary stimulation. The primary stimulation is about drawing out the assumptions and basic ideas of a situation and why it is the way it is. Okay, so you'll have a couple of these expansive learning phases called questioning and analysis, and it's really trying to work out where we have come from to get where we are, where we've got this problem. Okay, that we want to make a change in an organisation. And so it's allowing people to begin to develop their own artifacts, those tools to understand it. What's the history of how we got here? How do various parts of an organisation mix to generate this? What are their motivations around what they're doing? You're trying to get all this information out, okay? And get them where you're going, yeah, that's what it is. The secondary stimulation, key part of the double stimulation in many ways, is then to take that and turn it on its head in some ways. Okay, to get them thinking very differently about it. So in the students example, what I was doing with the placement students, what we began to notice as we was drawing the base assumptions out is very much this case of theories for assessment. And it's quite clear from a lot of the statements the students were making about what is the purpose of education. It's just to do assessment. It's just to get this qualification. It's to follow this syllabus. It's a very certain environment. They know the form the questions are coming in. Answers are in the back of the book. They know the exact syllabus that it's going to be.
It's that structure element as well. It's like it's something that you could probably never apply to the workplace. Is the fact that some things some students use is the fact that what happened, and I used this as well. What was on the past exam papers, and can they therefore predict what is going to happen?
Exactly. It's exactly that sort of thing. Whereas business, as you know, there is a lot of certainty in it. You've got a fairly good idea what you're going to be doing in a day, but there's a hell of a lot of curveballs as well. There's a hell of a lot of uncertainty that goes on, a lot of shocks in the day you can get. Okay, so the students have this notion that this attitude towards education of it being very structured and all these kind of ideas like that, and what we were trying to do was begin to upset the apple cart a bit and to begin to get them to feel theory not something so much as a highly structured tool, but a starting point to explore issues. More importantly for me is not so much the learning of theory, but is how to produce theory yourselves. One of the big problems with education is it turns people into consumers of knowledge rather than producers of knowledge. And I think once you get into a business environment, you're a producer. You're not a consumer. You're creating what's going on in those businesses. And for me, the role of HE is really to help generate producers of knowledge.
I really like that point that you're saying, because I can't remember who was saying, but I remember watching something he was saying, and I think it might have been a comedian. He was saying, like, I am an idiot because at the end of the day, and he's quite known for being very well spoken and demonstrates a lot of factors. Everything I've ever learned is something I've recalled from what someone else has said, agreed with, and then repeated. I've just gathered all this knowledge, and then that has contributed to my viewpoints. I have never gone out and thought and created a viewpoint or created something and methodologically thought of something and then made it. And he was saying that's the distinct of those who are in intelligence-wise are up there, and then the rest of us.
See, I don't think it's quite. I think we're all kind of a bit of a mix. It's a spectrum in some ways. I think the amount of university students who have gone through my hands over the many years, there are some of them I look and go, oh my God, you are much better than I am and ever will be. You know, you are dealing with some incredibly bright individuals, but even those who aren't incredibly bright are bloody bright. You know, they're quite capable of being these kind of producers of knowledge as well. So getting back to that secondary stimulation is trying to turn that on the head. One of the tools I actually used in this was I provided the students at one point, and one of the things they needed to reflect on, with a web page to do with musical theory. I then provided them with the musical score for the song Something by the Beatles, George Harrison, one of the greatest songwriters ever, I personally believe.
Massively underrated.
Yes, and Something is just a superb tune. So they had this web page on musical theory, they had the musical score for Something, and then I provided them with 2 YouTube videos of different performances of Something. Classic Beatles one, and then the one that was done in the tribute performance for George Harrison. And they're very, very different. And I asked them to reflect on, what does this say about theory? And all of a sudden, you can see the students beginning to go, context. Context really matters. Just because you have a theory doesn't mean, in essence, the song, the musical score comes out of musical theory, but we've got millions of tunes. Yeah, and they've all come out of the same theories. It's just different people applying it in different ways. And even Something, which is theoretically should produce the same sound every time, that musical score, well, actually, once it gets into the hands of performers, you can get very different performances coming out as they apply it. And suddenly students begin to think about theory not as something you strictly apply, but as a tool to explore and maybe a starting point for application, but something they need to shape themselves. It's trying to encourage them not to be slaves to theory, okay, because I'm not. I'm quite critical of a lot of theory. But we often talk about in higher education at university, we often talk about critical thinking. And it's getting their mind into that space of critical thinking, to not just accept theory, but to think about what its flaws are, where its limitations are, how it applies to a particular context. And in that double stimulation, you begin to see the students flipping in terms of how they approach theory and how they begin to see it much more clearly in the world around them, and begin to be able, most importantly in my mind, to be able to dissect it and to critique it and to adapt it and change it to suit themselves. They became producers of knowledge. They were no longer just consuming. And it's that huge step. And that's kind of why I chose the Change Laboratory, because it was all about allowing people to reorient an understanding of a situation for themselves, and it's about re-enabling their agency. In essence, when we talk about agencies, people's ability to apply free will, if you like, to be able to do what they want to do. Now, we don't have perfect free will. We live in the structures of society, but education had begun to rob these students of their agency. All they wanted to know is, well, what's the answer? What's the structure of the answer? How's this going to be? A classic thing I sometimes say is A-level often says there's no such thing as the right answer, but here's the 8 right answers you must have on the exam paper. And so students are permanently looking for that. And that's them handing their agency over, going, you tell me what to do. And that's not what we want in a business environment. We want people who are going to work out things for themselves. And so we want to re-enable that agency. And that's what this Change Laboratory is about. Is about giving them a space in which to begin to explore the problem and re-engage their own reasoning, their own ability to take a bit more control. And I found both that theoretical lens of activity theory and the method of the Change Laboratory were very helpful in constructing a set of activities the students could do while they're on placement, and giving them space to reflect and begin to change, and to begin to get, I think, a better understanding of the relationship between theory and practice.
I think it's a very good way how you approached it. I think, especially with the relevance of the George Harrison bit and the Beatles, with the aspect of, if you're going to send some students away all across different parts of the country, and you're going to say, right, okay, try to apply, I'm not saying this, but try to, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how you're going to apply it to the thing and see if it will work. That's just, a student's not going to take that and just think, right, okay, I'm going to try and to apply it there. No, it's difficult for when you've grown up in all your life doing one thing, and then someone says, right, now do it like this. it seems with the methods that you used there, you helped create the links, and they've all had that. Ah, right, okay, now that makes sense. And
the aha moments.
Yeah, the ding, the light bulb going off. That's what I meant to say.
I like the aha moment.
Yeah.
Because you feel that switch going on in your head, don't you, as you begin to sort of click what's going on. I think you're right. When you talk about all your life, 13, 14 years, students will have spent in education being trained to do things in certain ways. You went to Liverpool where I taught, and Liverpool's a red brick university, one of the so-called elite universities. And, these students coming there are, A-star students, that sort of thing. And they're being told they're good students the whole of their life. And then they come to us, and in the first couple of semesters, they're getting 40% or 50%. Suddenly, they're not good students anymore because the game has just changed on them. And it takes them a long time to begin to understand the game. 13 or 14 years of honing and practicing a particular kind of skill to pass assessment. Not a particularly useful skill, if you ask me, but they've practiced and honed it to absolute perfection. And then they come to university and we're asking them to think critically, something they've not really necessarily done much before. And it throws them quite a lot. And it's trying to find ways in which to open this up to them. And through the placement and through that boundary situation students find themselves in, they're in the workplace, they're doing a professional piece of work, but they're still students. It's a really nice position to begin to open up those possibilities.
I do really get with that aspect of the whole top dog thing, because when I came into Liverpool University in my second year, and I went to a non-red brick for my first one, and I remember coming in, and with the first one that I went to, there was a lot smaller classes, there was kind of more time interacting with your lecturer. I remember coming in and thinking, right, this is a bit more serious, and I've quickly adapted, fair enough, but I do get that. I mean, when you come straight from the aspect of some people as well, because they have school and then they stay within school for the college, so nothing really changes, and they leave with A stars, A's, or whatever it is, and then they come in and then they've been taught, like you said, all this time to, right, okay, if you do this, you'll pass, by teachers who need them to pass because it reflects on them, so they will do everything that they can to make sure that they pass that certain exam. They come in and they're not suddenly surrounded by everything that they know that will help them pass just to an exam. And for someone says to you, right, okay, this means this, and then you take the critical aspect of it, but why does it mean this? And I think when people kind of look back, sometimes people may forget of people of students in that position of how you are. It's easy to look back and think, oh, right, okay, that's fine, this is that. But when you're in that position, it's really daunting, because you're trying to essentially change the way of how you're thinking.
It's a weird one, university, because it's the vast majority of university courses are not really vocational. Okay, some are. If you're going to do medicine, you're more than likely going to be a doctor. If you're doing nursing, you're more than likely going to end up a nurse. But most university courses are not vocational as such. Otherwise, we'd have millions of English teachers. People who study an English degree don't necessarily go in and teach English after it. They can go into marketing, they can go into all the kinds of areas of business management, all kinds of things like that. If you want to go into business, you don't have to do a business studies program or business management. You can study anything. A degree, in many ways, is about how you think, the process of thinking, that critical thinking as we describe it. And the subject knowledge isn't irrelevant. If you are studying business, you'd hope you'd learn something about the techniques of operations management at some point. What is lean? What is Kaizen? All those kinds of ideas.
Bring me back.
That other aspect, that learning how to think, is quite critical to it, okay? And I tend to break it down for a lot of my students into, rather than read, remember, recall, which is what they were doing pre-HE, what they're coming to do here is collect, analyse, interpret, communicate, okay? So politicians often go, oh, what's the point in doing essays? You'll never do essays again in your life. Well, you're right in the sense of you won't write in that formal communication tone. Okay? But an essay is just that. It's a communication. Okay? It's a particular academic form of communication. It's a fairly straightforward form of communication once you begin to understand the formula for it, if you like. But actually, to be able to write an essay, you've got to collect data that's appropriate to the problem that you're trying to solve. You've got to apply the appropriate analytic techniques to that data. You've then got to interpret the findings from that analysis. Okay, you develop your recommendations, say, for an organisation. And then you could have all kinds of forms of communication. It could be an essay. It could be a report. Reports are for all kinds of different audiences. It could be a presentation. Yeah. So to say they'll never write an essay, well, yeah, that's true. It's it's quite obvious they won't. But actually, all the things they'll have to do to produce a good essay, to develop a strong argument, a line of reasoning, that collect, analyse, interpret. Well, actually, they'll do that whether they're doing a report, whether they're doing a piece of work in the workplace.
What that highlights to me is essentially what you're describing there is emails. We've all, if you worked in a room, you've been around people that don't really write emails as informative as they should be, or they don't flow well. When you get a good email and you get it all in one, you're like, right, thank you. That's something all like up. And them skills that you're saying there, we've seen. All right, well, you're not going to write essays. Them skills that you're learning from the essays is the fact that you can put them in actions like writing emails effectively, and then you're informing other members or external businesses, whoever you're communicating with, effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And the best students tend to get this. They tend to appreciate, actually, when we're writing an essay, we're learning to communicate with a particular audience. When we're giving a report, we have to think about who the audience is for that report, rather than just trying to do an essay with a few headings in it. Because it needs a different tone. It needs to be sent a different way. Just imagine if you're doing a report for senior managers and you write like an essay. I can just imagine a senior manager sitting there going, get to the point, just get to the point. What's the point? So best students, I think, do tend to begin to appreciate that the way they view things is beginning to change, okay? And they appreciate the importance of being able to collect data in an appropriate manner, analyse it in an appropriate manner, and develop their interpretation of that, and then communicate it. Many students, because they've been through 14 years and education is purely about sort of saying what the grades have said before and getting the right answer, they don't necessarily click it, unfortunately, because we do leave you to explore it more. But in this placement, I wanted to look at a mode of teaching. It's kind of Socratic in a way. You're not there yourself physically questioning them all the time and sort of drilling into what they're thinking about, but you're giving them a space to reflect on some basic ideas that you've set for them.
All right. Yeah, that makes it. Yeah. So it's a very good introduction of everything. What were the kind of key things that you found then after doing everything?
For me, we kind of touched on them a few times.
So the mediator was a big factor?
Yeah, so, well, it's, if we think about education, or if we think about theory in terms of mediation, yeah? So theory stands between the stimulus and our response. So we're given a problem in the workplace that we need to solve, yeah? Or we're asked a question and we need to provide an answer for it, okay? Theory can play a role of mediating how we develop the response. But the reality is the students weren't doing this, yeah? They were they were essentially reinventing theory for themselves in many ways, but I'll come back to this.
Yeah.
What had happened is that the theory taught in education has been misdirected as a mediator. So if you think of mediate as a vector, yeah, so having strength and direction, okay? So, we were talking about influences in our lives as we grow up and they shape the way we think. Some things are a stronger influence than others, yeah? So that's the strength of it. Well, in this case, it wasn't necessarily that theory has no strength. It played an important role, and they saw it as important for their exams, but its direction was misdirected. It wasn't seen as a tool to explore the world and intervene in the world. It was simply a tool for exams, setting mnemonics, for example, for an exam. That's all it was. It was of no use. So when the students in placement were coming to begin to their professional practice, rather than using theory to help mediate, it was nowhere in sight. It was just kind of ditched. Now, that doesn't mean they don't use theory. We bizarrely, all animals could be talked about as theory machines. Yeah, we're really pattern matchers. That's what we are as animals. We look for patterns, and we use those patterns to try and do predictions in the world, to intervene in the world. You could talk about a tree shrew being a theoretical specialist in bush rustles. So, it's wandering around a forest floor or climbing the trees, whatever they do, and it's hearing all these rustles in bushes. And it knows the difference between a rustle that is, or a pattern of rustles in the bush that is something it can eat or something that can eat it. And if it gets it wrong, it can be quite disastrous. Okay? So it has a set of theories, it has a set of patterns. And that's what we as humans do. We look for patterns all the time. Once we're past sort of primary school age, we don't really read anymore. We pattern match. Yeah? We do read as we're learning at cat, but at bat and all that, and that kind of sort of sounding out as we're reading. But once we get to a certain age and we're scanning through, we're really just seeing a pattern of symbols, and they're connected to an association of ideas. So it's the patterns that matter. There's an interesting experiment, I think it came out of Cambridge, where they kept the first and last letter of a word the same, but then jumbled all the other letters. And they made sentences like that. And you could still read the sentence, because it was just a pattern of symbols together that clicked with an association.
If anyone's ever had to read some, especially with I've got someone with the elder generation, and they don't like to work with computers, so they write a letter down and they've got really bad handwriting. It's the exact thing that you've got to use there, because you're like, what? What's that? And then what I have to do is I don't know that word, but if I read the rest of the sentence, then maybe I'll be able to understand that word.
Exactly, it's that kind of thing. It's that pattern matching ability that we've got, and just because we see patterns doesn't mean there's really a pattern there. It's just a pattern we discern. So classic superstitions, football fans wearing the same underwear at every single match and never having washed them because they scored a goal in the FA Cup in 1983. They identify these patterns and they kind of live on as if there's some kind of construct that's real. And that, in essence, is what theory is. But in academia, we become very rigorous about it. We test and test and test. And we try to understand the underlying assumptions. We test those underlying assumptions. We have massive discussion, debate around this. And that's what we're trying to teach our students. So what was happening is they're given a set of theories that have been through these kind of rigorous processes, and they ditch them, and they start doing their own little patterns, or they may be taking things off of their colleagues around them that have been through the same process. But they're not necessarily treating with the same rigour. So they can enter into a kind of space between superstition and theory in many ways. And so one of the key findings is that this misdirection of the theory as a mediator actually begins to disarm students in the face of trying to solve problems. Okay, so that was a key thing. And education, in the conceptions of the student, in the perceptions of the students, was probably what was driving this. Because again, as we mentioned before, to them it was all about a syllabus, it was all about assessment. It wasn't learning theory for any reason other than to pass an assessment. And so that seemed to have driven that misdirection. And in misdirecting it, it actually begins to disarm us. We seem to have lost a lot of the things we learned in the Enlightenment, the scientific method in many ways, that rigor, that systematic testing. And, you have to say, once you're dealing with social theories, they're flawed. Okay? it's not they're wrong, they're flawed, they have their limitations. You imagine a lot of discussion around theory in business. How many businesses can an individual researcher deal with in their academic lifetime? 10, 20, 100? How many businesses are there in Europe? Millions.
And then you're talking about sectors as well. If you're just talking, there's so many sectors that you could just do manufacturing service, which you couldn't go down to the nitty gritty. Even if you were trying to do like subsectors, you didn't have the time to do it, and it's so difficult. I think one of the aspects of trying to implement theory is just it's disregarded by so many, I think. And I think there's the aspect of people grow up, and I think one of the responses that I found within the research paper that you did was there was a couple who was like, I'm tired when I get home from work. I just want to go in and do work. And people so many people relate to that. We go in, we want to do the job done, and maybe you don't have the energy or the time or anything, just think, right, okay, what can I do to apply this theory to improve something? And the best kind of aspect I think of this is that why don't people, because the majority of students, they have part-time jobs. I had part-time jobs throughout I was in, and the majority of friends I have had part-time jobs. And this placement here that you had was to try and kind of apply theory and to get the work experience. But why aren't generally students applying that theory of aspect of maybe inventory management to their part-time jobs to kind of improve certain aspects?
I don't know.
Exactly.
Have to ask them.
Exactly. But this is that thing, isn't it?
It's also remembering, when you're young, there's a lot of other things going on in your life. There are a lot of other priorities, and I tell you now, applying theory in your part-time job, I'm sure, is not one of them. Was I any different when I was that age? Of course I wasn't. No. There are very many pretty individuals passing by in life, and they take priority, or they did in my time, over and above sort of applying what I was learning at university and those social interactions that were going on. That's just part of being young in some ways. It's the job of the educator to actually put in place sets of things that people can do that begin to inspire them around this, begin to challenge their thinking, begin to open their minds up. And we can't do it for everyone. Some people just are not engaged and are intentionally not engaged. But for those who are, we do have to think about different modes of teaching, such as this change laboratory, such as this double stimulation that allows them to explore it. So for me, one of the big key things was kind of going, theory is of no use to them because they can't see that it's of use to them. And then the next big thing was realising how you can use something like the double stimulation and the change laboratory to draw out assumptions and then throw these assumptions on their head. What I call putting the cognitive cat amongst the pigeons to startle them out of their ways of thinking. And if you've had 13, 14 years of being trained to think in a particular way around education, and then we've got 3, maybe 4 years to change it, that's not easy.
It's not a good ratio,
really
is it?
Yeah, these are. We talk about how difficult it is to break habits. You've built huge habits in learning that is to do with consumption, and we're trying to turn you into producers. And so, in amongst all that difficulty is us trying different modes out to hit individual students to get them to make those changes. I think they were the key things. Is actually theory doesn't appear to be of use to students, and that the reason is not because theory isn't useful, but because theory they don't see it being of use. They've been trained not to see it of use, and we need to throw them out of it. And actually, something like the change laboratory, this double stimulation, can be part of our armoury in which to get them to rethink its use. But it's not just that change laboratory. I think that the position they were in, that boundary position of being both a student, therefore having to do the assessment, and being in a workplace and having to do work in a professional environment, brought those two worlds into close collision, generating a lot of the structural tensions that they were needing to resolve. There was a necessity for them to do it, which allowed for the double stimulation to take effect and the change laboratory to work. So they were the key things for me, I think.
See, one point I kind of want to highlight, it was kind of the main inspiration for me wanting to do this with you. I remember it was a while ago when we met, and you said, when you're speaking about this research, was the fact that you enjoy to learn theory to understand, while you see a lot of students who, like we said, what we've been speaking about this past conversation is the fact that they learn just to pass exams and they become exam machines. And do you think that's down to the individual of their approach towards theory, or do you think what we've been talking about, how you've been taught at school, do you think it's a generational difference, or do you think it's a mix of both?
I don't think it's anything specific to do with the generation. Because, I look back when I was that age, and I think I went through a very similar process. I think, again, we were mentioning before, especially when you're young, there's so much going on, that life is so fresh. You go away to university, it's probably the first time you've lived alone, or lived away from your parents, away from home. So you're learning how to do that. You're learning how to cook. You're probably not learning how to cook. You're, all of a sudden you're away from all the friends you were with, and you're trying to make new friends. That there's a statement we always say, the friends you make in the first week. I'll say again. The first semester is spent trying to get rid of the friends you made in the first week at university, because you're desperately trying to cling on to anyone. So there's so much going on in that period of your life that people can become quite instrumental in what they do. Okay? What I mean by that is they are very strategic in what they pick and choose. And they will carry out actions. There's this economy of effort being taken place to try and get over the next hurdle. And doing a degree is just another hurdle. You need that 2-1 or that first. To get a good job, for example, gets fixated in their head. So what do I need to do that? And there are only certain occasions in which this tends to break. Placement can be one of them, where the structural tensions become acute, as was mentioned before. Another one is interest. Just think about sort of the modules you did that you just were interested in. They just grabbed your imagination, and all of a sudden you were looking wider and thinking about things, and you were having your brain scrambled by a particular lecture. And it can be, it'll be a different situation for all students. They are the kind of small cracks in which we as educators can try to funnel some of this learning in. But I just think it's a natural process of being young. There's that for many there can be a natural arrogance of being young, thinking you know everything, and what do older generations know? And that's no different from when I was your sort of 18, 19 to the 18, 19, 20-year-olds of today. So I don't think it's anything new, and I don't think it's going to disappear overnight. I think education, as it stands at the moment, appears to exacerbate it, especially pre-HE. And we have a lot of pressures on us in HE now to follow very similar things. That the need to satisfy students, and if students are being highly instrumental, the need to sort of satisfy that instrumentalism, and it can be quite a fight for us to try and still produce an environment in which students are challenged to think about their assumptions, the way they approach problems, and to think about how they can use theory to, one, understand the world, but two, to intervene within it as well. And I think we don't always succeed in that.
Do you think there's an aspect of where some people try to apply theory to things that are very, very difficult to be theoretically taught, or can't be theoretically taught? In the aspect of the example I'm thinking of is leadership. I've had leadership to be tried to taught theoretically to me, which I find a very struggle thing to do that can't be done practically. I think that's something that is either nurtured, that people grow up to be leaders, or it's something that you learn from the environment around you, from real life experiences. In the context of leadership, I found it very difficult to understand what I was learning off a PowerPoint or from like a book, and then how it can be applied effectively.
I think we're nearly everything in life, theory alone will not teach you it. You have to, at some point, apply it. Okay, you have to try it out, these different things. But as I said before, as pattern matching creatures, theory is how we simplify. The world is a very messy and complex environment. Yeah? It's a little bit like painting DNA, a Jackson Pollock painting of DNA. So messy as in the Jackson Pollock state, complex as in all those interactions within the chromosomes, leading to the expression of proteins over time that lead to sort of certain physical traits in individuals, and even potentially can lead to sort of personality traits, things like that. We as humans can't take all of that information in. No animal can. So we have to simplify. Theory is part of that simplification process, that finding simple patterns in relationships between things. So we do it. It's a normal, natural part. So for me, absolutely everything can be theorised around. Okay? But for all individuals, I don't think it's enough to read a book and go, I get it now. You've got to do it. And in doing it, you can't just do it and simply get it. You then have to think and reflect upon, well, I did this. How did it fit with what the theory was saying? Yeah? And I often talk with students, especially doing dissertations, is that to truly understand the theory and its flaws, you first of all need to apply it rigidly. And in the rigid application, you begin to see where it does and doesn't work under certain conditions. And then you can begin to adapt it. Yeah, make changes to it to fit the circumstances and the situation that you specifically find yourself in. So I think even something like leadership can be sort of theorized about, and it can help people understand it. Will it make them good leaders? No, not at all. Even through practice and reflecting, will it necessarily make them good leaders? No, I'm not convinced. Okay, so I think there's a number of questions here. It's not simply does theory make us good leaders? It's can you theorise about leadership? Yeah, of course you can. Theorise about anything at the end of the day. But does understanding those theories and being able to sort of talk about them in an essay, will that make you a good leader? Absolutely not.
Yeah. So is it in the context of leadership, is it what you learned there, is it that effective in, because there's some areas where theory is more impactful in how you can do, and then there's some aspects of where theory is just doesn't seem like it's that potentially particularly useful, which is why I'm using the aspect of leadership. You see so many people bring out like leadership books and all this, and then there's some things that are in the aspect of, if you learn about inventory management, it seems there's more theoretical concepts that can be applied more strategically and more relevant. Do you understand?
I get what you're getting to. There does seem to be this kind of break between something that's numerate, like inventory control, and something that has to do with humans. And you just got to remember, humans are messy little buggers. Yeah? And, you think you've got a grip of someone, and then they do something you've never expected before. And again, think back to activity theory. The reason they may have changed is another mediation has occurred. Something else has influenced them in another direction that you may know nothing about. It's a complex and messy environment. Whereas in something like inventory management, there's a few variables that you're trying to get a grip of. It's much more simplified, and they seem to work. But they don't always. Economic order quantity. I'm sure I taught you that in your first year at university about economic order quantity. And people apply it in all kinds of situations. Whereas economic order quantity basically says it only works in stable environments where you've got steady demand. As soon as you move out of a steady, predictable demand, economic order quantity doesn't work at all and is just not applicable. And I have seen companies try to apply economic order quantity and go, this theory doesn't work. Well, it does if you apply it in the right bloody place.
Yeah.
Under the right sort of circumstances. Something like inventory management, it's easier to see that.
Yeah.
Something like leadership, where you're dealing with the complexities of human motivations, I think it's much more difficult. Much, much more difficult. But it doesn't mean it's meaningless.
Right. So it's more the aspect of putting more effort in and trying to understand it and apply it more variantly, rather than just shaking a stick in it and expecting it to work.
It's a good way of putting it. Shaking a stick at me to get them to work. Doesn't get students to work, I've tried.
So, in your aspect, if you could have one way, if you could have a go at it, of trying to reduce the conflict between theoretical and practical for university students, what would be a way that you would try and do it?
I'm not sure I want to reduce the conflict. I'm not sure, one, you can, and two, it is the conflict between the two that actually allows us to come up with new ideas about doing things. There's another thing in activity theory which is quite important, and it's about addressing the learning paradox. That is, how do simple systems create systems more complex than themselves? Yeah? So in essence, how do we as humans go from the plains of Africa in hunter-gatherer sort of tribes, clans, groupings, and produce the world we're in today? Yeah? Sort of the internet, the planes in the sky, that's just stunning when you think about it. Yeah? When, our main sort of tools were sticks in our hands, and all of a sudden we've got aircraft flying in the sky and staying in the sky most of the time. That's quite stunning. How does a simple system, such as human hunter-gatherer societies, become complex, globalised capitalism? And the way in which sort of activity theory tries to sort of answer this learning paradox is to understand the interplay between something called internalization, externalization. So internalization is when you've got those mediators affecting you. So you're reading a paper about a particular theory, or somebody's telling you about something, or you're witnessing something going on. So you've got those mediations going on. It's that voice in your head. You remember when you were sort of writing an essay, you wouldn't just you'd be doing it in your head, or you might be doing a presentation and you'd be rehearsing. That kind of sort of space in your head where you're visualising what may occur. You're going to split up with your girlfriend, so you're rehearsing the conversation that's going to be had. So you're going to split up with your girlfriend, so you're rehearsing that conversation. You'll say this and she'll say that.
If anyone's ever had an argument with just your girlfriend or anyone, you try to rehearse the argument and it never goes like that.
But we do it. It's that process of internalisation, that making sense of stuff, and we do it all the time, okay? And once we make sense of something, we then act on the basis of that understanding, that sense-making process. So we externalise, yeah? And that externalisation can be our behaviours. We can write an essay, we can write a report for business, an email, whatever, but we externalise, okay? And in externalising, other people are seeing that, and they're then internalising, yeah? But when we internalise, we don't internalise perfectly. So I'm constantly amazed if I deliver a lecture, then a student comes up to me to ask some questions and said, you said this, and I'm sitting there going, I never said that. When did I say that? And that's their internalisation process going on and being imperfect. And that imperfect can be seen as a bad thing. Yeah. Whereas for me, it just is. It's just humans don't hear perfectly. They've got other things going in their head. They're not always listening to the lecture at the front. They're not always listening to what the boss is telling them, or they don't make notes of it, or their notes are imperfect, and so they're filling gaps in many ways.
The brain's such a busy place that's going on. You're trying to focus on something, and then you're like, what am I having for tea tonight? You come back and then
your phone's pinging away at you. The distractions are hundreds in this complex society of ours. So, but that imperfect place also means we can have leaps of intuition. So we see it differently to what we heard, and then we externalise, and all of a sudden we're starting down a new path that could be highly fruitful, could be highly towards making a change. Yeah? It's like a mutation in genetics, okay? Lots of those imperfections go nowhere and end up with nothing. But very often they can lead to very new, different ways of thinking about things. So that kind of dance of internalization, externalization in a society like ours with complex tools such as language, that's how you begin to answer that learning paradox. So I can't remember what we were asking the question.
We went on a mad little tangent, didn't we?
But that to me is kind of what we're doing as a species. And education is an intentional attempt to do all of that.
Fantastic. That was been a really great chat. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
But finally, just this can be within to anything. If you can give advice about one thing, what would it be? Could be to students, could be to fellow PhD thing, just anything that you think you'd give advice to.
The biggest advice is be curious. Why? Probably the most important question. Why? Just be curious. That's it, about anything and everything.
All right.
Simple.
It's a great bit of advice. Thank you very much, Simon.
Pleasure. Thank you, Harris.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, feel free to subscribe and share, and give the show a 5-star rating on all the podcast apps. Thank you.